The whispers started the moment the ink dried on the marriage certificate. In a town so small you could hear a secret from one end to the other, this was a story that defied all logic. A 60-year-old widow, a woman known for the dignified silence of her grief and the quiet rhythm of her solitary life, had married a 20-year-old. Not a man, a boy. He was all restless energy and smooth skin, a vibrant, living contradiction to her soft, settled grief. She was old money, not in wealth, but in time. Her house was a museum of a life well lived and respectfully ended. He, on the other hand, was nothing. A drifter, a face with no past, who had floated into town and, somehow, right into her life. The town held its breath. They watched, and they waited. They waited for the inevitable scandal, the juicy headlines about a foolish old woman swindled out of her savings. They waited for him to take her car, her jewelry, the deed to the house, and just disappear. But he didn't. Days turned into weeks, and the couple became like ghosts walking in broad daylight. You could see them, but you couldn't understand them. He'd be in her garden, not planting flowers, but digging. Digging with an intensity that felt almost frantic, moving massive piles of soil from one end of the yard to the other. She would just watch from the porch, wrapped in a shawl. Her face completely unreadable. They didn't hold hands in public. They didn't laugh over coffee at the local diner. Their relationship didn't fit any known narrative of love, or even of cunning manipulation. It was just a shared space of strange, quiet purpose. The few neighbors who tried to visit were turned away, not rudely, just firmly. The widow, who was once a fixture at the community bake sale, was now a recluse, guarded by this 20-year-old enigma. The curtains of her beautiful old house, which were once always open to the sun, were now perpetually drawn. The suspense in town grew thicker by the day, like a heavy, humid blanket. What in the world was happening in that house? The whispers grew darker, more sinister. Was she sick? Was he holding her captive? Someone finally called the police. The officers did a welfare check, but they came back just as baffled as everyone else. The woman was perfectly lucid, they reported. The young man was polite. They were fine. They just, in the officer's own words, wanted to be left alone. Of course, this only fanned the flames of speculation. One stormy evening, the town's self-appointed historian, an older woman who lived next door, just couldn't take it anymore. She heard a sound from the backyard. It wasn't a scream, not a fight. It was the sound of effort. A heavy, rhythmic thudding, over and over, even in the pouring rain. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she crept to her fence and peered through the rain-slicked slats. The backyard was lit by a single, harsh floodlight. The young man was drenched, covered head to toe in mud, and still digging. He had been at it for weeks, but now, it looked like he had finally hit something. He was pulling at a large, flat object in the ground. And the widow was there too, standing under a small umbrella, her face illuminated by the stark light. She wasn't scared. She wasn't confused. She looked expectant. The neighbor fumbled for her phone, ready to call the police again. This was it. He was digging a grave. Or maybe digging one up. But then, with a final, massive heave, the young man pulled the object free. It wasn't a box. It was a stone slab, covered in decades of grime. He worked frantically, wiping it clean with his sleeve. The widow dropped her umbrella. She moved forward, her hand outstretched, her fingers trembling as she traced something etched on the stone. The neighbor zoomed in with her phone, the grainy image finally focusing. It wasn't a gravestone. Buried beneath the slab was a metal box, rusted and sealed shut. The young man took a crowbar and pried it open. Inside, wrapped carefully in old oilcloth, were letters and a small, tin toy soldier. The widow sank to her knees in the mud. She picked up the tiny soldier, and a sound tore from her throat, a sound the neighbor had never heard before. It wasn't grief. It was recognition. The young man didn't touch her. He just stood back, his shoulders heaving with exhaustion. His job apparently done. The shock that hit the town the next day wasn't the one anyone expected. The true story unraveled, not in a police report, but in the quiet, stunned realization of the community. The widow had a brother. A twin brother. He had died in a tragic accident at 20 years old, just before he was supposed to leave for the army. They had buried this box in the backyard together, a secret pact to open it on their 60th birthday. Her late husband, a kind and loving man, never even knew. It was a grief she had kept entirely separate, a piece of her soul she had buried with her twin. But with time, her memory had faded. She had forgotten the exact spot. She had spent years searching her own garden, quietly, lost in a fog of age and loss. And the 20-year-old boy. He was the grandson of her brother's best friend. He had found his grandfather's old journals. And in them, a hand-drawn map of the backyard, and the story of two twins and their hidden promise. He had sought her out, not for her money, but to deliver a message from the past. He found a woman consumed by one last, unfulfilled duty to the dead, the marriage. It was never a marriage, it was a contract. It was the only legal way she could think of to let him live there, to let him dig, to excavate her past without any family interference. It was a desperate, bizarre, and profoundly human pact. The shock wasn't the scandal. The shock was the complete lack of one. The shock was realizing that while the whole town saw a predator and his prey, the reality was a history project. An act of profound, agonizing closure. The shock was that this 60-year-old widow hadn't lost her mind to a young boy, she had used him to find a piece of herself she had lost 40 years ago. The digging stopped. The curtains in the old house opened once again. And the next Sunday, the widow was seen at the diner. Alone. She sat in a booth, ate a slice of apple pie, paid her bill, and left a very, very generous tip. The young man was gone. He had a bus ticket, a backpack, and a quiet thank you from a woman who could finally, truly, rest. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.